Have you ever stopped to think that the spiritual history of humanity may have begun long before the Bible? What if everything you've learned so far about faith, revelation, and the beginnings of communication with God is incomplete? Or worse, missing essential pieces? You grew up hearing that it was in the Bible that God began speaking to mankind. But what if I told you that entire peoples were already connecting with the Creator centuries before the first line of Scripture was written? Yes, there is a forgotten, or rather, silenced people who spoke with the true God long before Moses, Abraham, or any biblical prophet. These people are rooted in Africa. They had no paper or ink, but had profound revelations. They didn't read verses, but heard the voice of the eternal through nature, dreams, the wind, and the rhythms of the earth. You need to know this. African spirituality is not a modern or folkloric invention. It is ancestral. It is sacred. It is powerful. While the West still sought gods in idols of stone and wood, many Africans already worshipped an invisible, eternal, and omnipresent creator. Names like Olodumare, Ma'at, Nzambi, and Amma echoed in villages and hearts as pure expressions of divinity. But why didn't anyone tell you this before? Why did they erase this rich, ancient spiritual connection from the history books? Why is it so difficult for the religious world to accept that Africa already knew and spoke to God before organized religion emerged? Have you ever noticed how we've been taught that God only began speaking to people after Abraham, after the tablets of the law, after the establishment of the chosen people? But what you'll see in this video may completely change your perspective. Because the truth is, the Creator was never tied to a culture, a people, or a book. You will be surprised to discover that long before there were biblical prophets, there were African leaders with spiritual gifts, divine wisdom, vision, ethics, and moral codes. These people did not need stone temples, because they knew that the body was a temple. They didn't need a book to know what was right or wrong, for they felt the presence of the Creator within them. And this is not a theory. This is recorded in anthropological, archaeological, and spiritual accounts. Orally transmitted rituals, chants, symbols, and stories reveal an authentic connection with the divine, long before the scriptures were canonized. Can you imagine this? African people praying to the supreme God when organized religions had not even been formed yet. This revelation is powerful, and that is why it has been stifled, distorted, and even demonized for centuries. But now, the time has come to bring this truth to light. Are you ready to rediscover the hidden origins of faith? Are you ready to see with your own eyes how the African people already related to God before the Bible, before churches, before religions as we know them today? So don't leave this video, because what I'm going to show you now can forever transform the way you see the Creator, spirituality, and your own story. Now that you've begun to see this truth with different eyes, I want to invite you to go beyond the information. Join the conversation. Leave a comment below. Did you know that African people spoke to the Creator before the Bible? What does this knowledge awaken in you? Does it affect your faith? Does it bother you? Or does it free you? I read every comment and respond personally whenever I can, because this space isn't just mine, it's ours. Here, we search together for the missing pieces of humanity's spiritual history. If this content made you reflect, please leave a like right now. It may seem like a simple gesture, but it helps this video reach more people who need to hear this truth hidden for centuries. And of course, subscribe to the channel. Here, we delve deep into topics no one dares to touch. Every week, surprising revelations, forgotten mysteries, and spiritual connections you never imagined will challenge you to see God with new eyes. This is just the beginning, so like, comment, subscribe, and get ready for what's coming next. Have you ever stopped to think that perhaps the Creator never belonged to a single culture? That He was never restricted to a single book or a single people? When we open our eyes and free ourselves from the rigid frameworks of Western religion, we begin to see something grand. God was already speaking to other nations long before the Bible was written. And here's a question that could shake up everything you believe. Could the Creator have been communicating with entire civilizations long before the Hebrew Scriptures emerged? This question is uncomfortable, it disturbs, but that's precisely why it needs to be asked. Because if God is eternal, sovereign, and omnipresent, then His voice echoed before papyrus, before sacred scrolls, before any written tradition. Ancient Africa is replete with evidence of this spiritual communication. People who didn't even know the word Bible knew, with a certainty born in their souls, that a supreme God existed. They didn't call him Jehovah, Yahweh, or Elohim, but acknowledged the existence of an invisible, intelligent, and personal creator. Olodumare among the Yoruba, Nzambi among the Bantu, Ama among the Dogon, Ra and Ma'at among the ancient Egyptians. All these names pointed to a single divine source. Now tell me, how is it possible that tribes separated by such vast geographical distances, who had no contact with the Hebrew or Greco-Roman world, had such profound concepts of justice, spirituality, purity, and life's purpose? The answer may lie in something many avoid admitting. The Creator has always revealed himself to his creation. The Bible is not the beginning. It is a chapter within a much larger story. Think about it. Was God silent for thousands of years, waiting for someone to invent writing so he could finally speak to humanity? Or has he always spoken through nature, dreams, consciousness, music, symbols, and oral wisdom? Was he already teaching values and guiding people, even without a holy book in hand? This is where you begin to realize how we've been conditioned to think small. We believe that anything that doesn't fit the biblical mold is inferior, pagan, and worthless. But what if it's just the opposite? What if these ancient cultures had a pure, uncontaminated perception of God's voice, a living, direct spirituality, without intermediaries, without stone temples or religious hierarchies? Ancient African peoples understood universal principles such as justice, balance, truth, hospitality, forgiveness, and the sacredness of life. They didn't need to read commandments written on tablets. They lived the commandments imprinted on their souls. It makes you think, doesn't it? And there's more. Why was this spiritual wisdom so silenced? Why were records of African spirituality destroyed, ridiculed, or erased? Why were you taught that Africa was a dark, lost, and godless continent? Because accepting that God already spoke to the African people before the Bible would challenge the entire structure of Western religious and cultural superiority. It would place the African continent, historically exploited, colonized, and subjugated, as a legitimate cradle of divine revelation. And this is frightening. It's frightening because it breaks with centuries of indoctrination and places the African people in the place they have always deserved, as bearers of light. Now stop and reflect. What if the Creator used the drums, the dances, the songs, the rites, the dreams, the griots, and the African elders to reveal his will? What if he was always present in the spirituality that welled up in the land, the rivers, the skies of Africa? That wouldn't just be logical. It would be fair, because the Creator is no respecter of persons. And if he is truly the Father of all, then he would never stop communicating with his children scattered throughout the earth, including those who have never heard of Abraham or Moses. And that's why this topic is so urgent, because it's not just a matter of religious history, it's a matter of spiritual identity. There are people today, perhaps even you who are watching, who feel disconnected, who feel like something doesn't fit. And perhaps this feeling exists because you were taught an incomplete version of the truth, a version that excludes the roots of your own people, a version that conceals the fact that the Creator has always been present, even when there was no Bible. Have you ever stopped to think why African spirituality was demonized for so long? Why did they call every form of worship that didn't fit European standards macumba or witchcraft? Because they knew there was power there. They knew that direct connection to the divine couldn't be controlled, domesticated, or institutionalized. And so, what they couldn't erase, they discredited. But now, the truth is coming to light. People are waking up. The curtain is rising. And the great question resonates more strongly than ever. Did God's revelation truly begin with the Bible? Or did it echo in the drums, in the rituals, in the words sung around the fire long before that? Your answer to this question can redefine everything. It can change the way you pray, how you read the Bible, how you understand Jesus' mission. It can even free you from the religious and mental prisons that have haunted you your entire life. But now I want to hear from you. Do you believe that the Creator already communicated with other nations before the Bible was written? Have you ever heard of Olodumare, Nzambi, Ma'at? Which part of this revelation has touched you the most so far? Leave it here in the comments. The Creator has always spoken to his people, even without a Bible. Or I am rediscovering my spirituality with these truths. But to understand how intentionally this truth was hidden, We must face head-on the grave and repeated error of Western history, the systematic distortion and erasure of the spiritual roots of the African people. For centuries, they constructed a narrative in which Africa was merely a setting for idolatry, darkness, and ignorance, while the light of revelation would only arrive through the Bible and European civilization. This is not only unfair, it is historically false. Have you ever noticed how school books, movies, and even religious sermons always portray Africa as a continent devoid of God? As if true spirituality only crossed the ocean on caravels, as if the name of God only echoed among black people after the arrival of the European missionary with the Bible in hand? But what if I told you that long before the Bible was compiled, the African people were already prostrating themselves before the Creator God, already performing ceremonies in honor of the invisible, already organizing their society based on elevated spiritual principles? This changes everything. It changes the perception of faith. It changes the identity of the people. It even changes Africa's place in human history. The mistake of Western history was to treat African cultures as inferior, because they didn't leave written records like Europeans, as if spirituality were only valid if it were in a book. But if you stop and think about it, the Bible itself was born from oral traditions. The sacred texts we have today came centuries after the spiritual experiences they narrate. So why consider African spirituality invalid simply because it was passed down by word of mouth, from elder to child, from generation to generation? This imposition of the European model of knowledge as the only valid path to truth is what destroyed the credibility of millions of sacred African stories. It was the colonizers who declared that anything that didn't resemble their religion was demonic. They were the ones who rewrote history, placing Africa as the tail, when in fact, for a long time, it was the head. The Bible itself speaks of Egypt, Ethiopia, and African kingdoms. Moses was raised in Egypt. Jesus lived for a time in Egypt. The Queen of Sheba came from Africa. The Ethiopian eunuch was baptized and brought the gospel to his land before many Europeans had even heard of Jesus. And yet, the West has insisted on ignoring all this to maintain a narrative in which divine revelation was European, white, and superior. It's hard to acknowledge this, I know, but it's necessary, because as long as we passively accept this distortion, we will continue to deny ourselves. We will continue to look to the Bible as if it were the ground zero of faith, ignoring that spirituality existed long before the Bible, ignoring that rituals, songs, principles of justice, and moral codes guided African peoples long before the tablets of the law, long before Solomon's temple, long before the scrolls. The error of Western history was also to confuse knowledge with domination. They didn't come to share spiritual wisdom. They came to erase the previous wisdom, to erase ancestral altars and build cathedrals, to erase sacred African names and impose new ones, to erase drums and replace them with organs, to erase dance as a spiritual expression and label it profane. All this in the name of a supposed universal truth that, in practice, was a tool of cultural and spiritual domination. When the Bible arrived in Africa through the hands of the colonizers, it did not arrive as a new revelation. It arrived as a weapon of control, and many African spiritual leaders of the time knew this. They did not reject the existence of the biblical God. They simply wondered why he now had to come with chains, with imposition, with guilt. They knew that the God their ancestors worshipped was not a stranger. He was the same creator, but now dressed in new clothing and hemmed in by rules that no longer recognized the freedom of the spirit. And this is where the disconnect began. Many children of Africa began to feel that their faith was wrong, that their culture was impure, that their blood was cursed. They began to reject their roots to be accepted by a religion that, ironically, was born and sustained by spiritual experiences similar to their own. And the greatest irony of all is that while this was happening, while Western thought labeled African beliefs as pagan, many African principles were closer to the heart of God than even Western religious systems. Because there, in the villages, in the rituals, in the proverbs, in the symbols, there was love, there was respect for creation, there was wisdom, there was justice, things often lacking in modern religious structures. Perhaps that's why so many people today are thirsty to rediscover their true spirituality. Tired of cold dogmas, empty rituals, and a soulless faith, they're turning their eyes back, not to retreat, but to reconnect, to say, Spirituality didn't begin with a book. It began with life. And in this reunion, there are tears. There is healing. There is truth. Because when you recognize that God already spoke to your ancestors, that He already walked with His people, that He never rejected you, something changes inside you. And maybe you're feeling it now. So take a deep breath. Allow yourself to feel this truth. And tell me, have you ever stopped to think about this? Have you ever reflected on how much history has hidden from you your own spiritual heritage? Right here in the comments. My faith didn't begin with the Bible. It began with my ancestors. Or, I am rediscovering my spiritual roots. I want to read your vision, your experience, your pain, your discovery. And it is here that we begin to touch on a truth that changes everything. The African people not only knew the Creator, they already lived with Him in deep connection, millennia before any biblical page was written. And it wasn't just intuition or vague belief. There was structure. There was spiritual organization. There were ethics. There were laws. There were principles so lofty that, studying them today, it feels like reading passages from Proverbs or the Sermon on the Mount. These spiritual roots are spread across several ancient African civilizations. One of the most impressive comes from ancient Kemet, which we now call Egypt. There, long before the Christian or Jewish era, people already spoke of Ma'at, a principle that governed the entire balance of the universe. Ma'at wasn't just a goddess, she was the very concept of divine order. She signified truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, and integrity. Those who lived according to Ma'at sought balance between heaven and earth, between the visible and the invisible, between their conduct and the collective good. And if they deviated from this path, they faced real spiritual consequences. Doesn't it sound familiar? Doesn't it remind you of the basis of all the Judeo-Christian morality that would come later? Another profound example comes from the Yoruba tradition, with the figure of Olodumare. Olodumare is not just one god among others. He is the supreme. He is the creator of all. He is the one who stands above the Orishas, above humanity, above time. The Yoruba knew that this god was unique, invisible, and impossible to represent through images. They accessed him through nature, prayer, ancestors, and oracles, means that did not diminish the sacred, but rather expanded the perception of the divine presence in all things. Olodumare is called the one who sees all, who knows all, who never dies, who is in everything. How many similarities to the biblical God can you count in just one sentence? And if we travel to the traditions of Congo and Angola, we will find Nzambi Mpungu, the supreme god of the Bantu worldview. For the Bakongo people, Nzambi was not just a distant force. He was the very source of life, he who breathes the spirit into the human body, who gives and takes away breath, who reveals himself in the sun, in the waters, in animals, in natural phenomena, and, above all, in consciousness. Nzambi is justice, he is light, he is moral, he is sovereign. There is no worship of images or multiple entities as colonial thought would have it. There is a monotheistic spiritual structure that long predates Christianity. And do you know what's most impressive? These people had structured spiritual laws, long before the idea of a commandment written in stone. Do not kill. Do not steal. Honor your parents. Live in truth. Reject evil. Do justice to the orphan. Be hospitable to the stranger. All of this was present in the oral traditions of these people, passed down with honor and reverence from generation to generation. And even though they weren't written in books, these laws were engraved in social practices, rituals, tales, songs, and chants that spanned the centuries. There was no need for papyrus ink or parchment, because spirituality wasn't an intellectual concept, it was lived in everyday life. The relationship with the sacred wasn't theoretical, it was existential. The divine didn't dwell only in a temple, it lived in a tree, in a river, in a mother's gaze, in the silence of an elderly person. The sacred was part of life. Just imagine, people already knew what fasting, purification, forgiveness, symbolic sacrifice, harvest celebrations, lunar calendar festivals, connection with the unseen, and separation between the profane and the holy were, long before any Hebrew priest recorded these practices in the Torah. This shows that there exists an ancient African spiritual wisdom, profound, coherent, and connected to the Creator, even without ever having read Genesis. And that bothers a lot of people to this day, because when this truth comes to light, it shatters the narrative that there is only one legitimate path to spirituality. It shows that the Bible is not the birth of faith, but rather one of its witnesses. One of the ways to record something that has existed in the heart of humanity since the beginning, especially in the heart of Africa. The connection with God, that is, with the invisible, with the eternal, with the organizing principle of all things, didn't begin with pen and paper. It began with creation itself, and Africa, as the cradle of humanity, was also the cradle of spirituality. That's a strong statement, I know, but it's undeniable when you look at it with clear eyes, without colonial prejudices, without the filter of religious domination. And perhaps you, listening to me now, are beginning to realize that your faith isn't something you inherited from Europe. Perhaps what pulses within you, this search for meaning, this thirst for something deeper, truer, more spiritual, perhaps it comes from the blood of your ancestors. Perhaps it's echoing within you because it's a call to return. Return to the origins. Return to the roots. Return to the source. These spiritual roots of the African people are alive. They didn't remain in the past. They are pulsing today, in their spiritual memory, in their instinct for justice, in their desire for a relationship with God that is truer and less rigid, more spiritual and less institutional, more connected and less conditioned by systems. And that's what many don't want you to know. Because once you recognize that your ancestors walked with God even before the Bible existed, no one can tell you that you need to fit into a religion to be accepted by the Creator. No one can convince you that you come from a cursed people. No one can make you doubt your spirituality, your connection, your essence. So now I want to hear from you. Leave us a comment. My roots are sacred, or my spirituality began before religion. And tell me if this is opening your eyes, if it resonates with something you've already felt deep down, even if you can't explain it. Comment, share your experience, and most importantly, don't let this conversation die here. And the more we turn our attention to these African spiritual roots, the more we realize that there wasn't just faith there. There was revelation. There was guidance. There was direct communication with the unseen. And if there was revelation, there were also those who received it. And this brings us to another point you may never have considered. Before there were Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, or John the Baptist, there were already African men and women who functioned as prophets. Yes, prophets. Only they didn't call themselves that. They were known as sages, elders, counselors, visionaries, griots, spiritual healers, ceremonial leaders. But their role was the same: to connect the people with the Creator's will. They were the ones who heard what others couldn't, those who saw signs in nature, who interpreted dreams, who warned the community of difficult times, who restored spiritual order when the laws of the sacred were broken. People like the Yoruba, the Ashanti, the Dogons, the Zulus, the Bantu, they all recognized the existence among them of individuals with specific spiritual gifts. People who not only knew, but felt. Who received messages that transcended time and space. Who translated the codes of the invisible with a clarity that startled even the most skeptical. They didn't have the Bible in their hands, but they had heaven open before their eyes. And the most beautiful thing of all is that these spiritual figures did not speak on their own behalf. They did not seek glory, fame, or prestige. They spoke for the collective. They spoke on behalf of the community. They spoke because of the suffering of the people. Their messages came from a deep place, charged with compassion and awareness. They knew they were dealing with greater forces, and so they treated spirituality with reverence, not vanity. How many times have you heard of biblical prophets who went against the system, who denounced injustice, who called for repentance, who announced judgment, who called the people back to their covenant with God? Now imagine this happening among African peoples, hundreds or thousands of years before the Jewish tradition recorded its own prophets. It's not theory, it's history, it's spiritual memory. And here it's important to say, these spiritual leaders were not isolated. They were part of a living network of wisdom transmission. The words they received didn't die within them, they spread, in the form of proverbs, songs, stories, rituals, symbols. Therefore, even without writing, spiritual knowledge survived for generations, intact, respected, protected. They knew it was sacred. These people were aware of the forces that govern the world. They knew how to discern spiritual time, the cycle of the seasons, the signs of the heavens, what was a curse and what was a blessing. They understood the power of the spoken word, of ceremonial silence, of music as a tool of elevation. Many carried consecrated objects and knew the paths of healing, purification, and liberation. They were not witches or sorcerers, as colonial thought tried to make them out to be. They were interpreters of the sacred. Have you ever noticed that many of the spiritual gifts mentioned in the New Testament, such as discernment, revelation, wisdom, healing, prophecy, dreams, and visions, already existed in these African traditions long before the Bible organized these concepts? This is no coincidence. This is a divine inheritance. This is the Spirit moving wherever He wishes, with whomever He wishes, however He wishes, without religious boundaries, without theological certifications, without institutional endorsement. These prophets before the prophets were respected, sometimes feared, because their presence carried spiritual weight. When they spoke, people stopped. When they pointed something out, everyone listened. When they called for fasting, everyone fasted. When they saw danger, they sounded the alarm. They were guardians of the truth, and because of this, many were persecuted. Many were silenced, because the system, whether political or religious, always fears those it cannot control. And it is precisely this fear that led to the attempt to erase these figures from history. Colonization not only took the Bible, it also led to an aggressive campaign to destroy African spiritual memory. Spiritual leaders were persecuted, killed, and ridiculed. Their teachings were called witchcraft. Their practices were criminalized. Their names were forgotten. And saddest of all, many of their own descendants were taught to reject them, despise them, and be ashamed of them. But truth has a power that time cannot erase. It always resurfaces. And today, we are here talking about them. We are here unearthing what they tried to bury. We are here hearing again the echo of ancestral wisdom that was denied to us for so long. And perhaps you, who are watching now, feel a shiver when you hear these words. Perhaps you feel like you already knew all of this, even without ever having read it in any book. Perhaps because these truths don't just reach our ears, they speak directly to the spirit. They touch something within us that was dormant, but that never ceased to exist. Can you see how deceived we have been? How far we have been alienated from ourselves, from our own ancestors, from our spiritual heritage? How many times have you been told that your ancestors were godless people, when in fact they were closer to the Creator than those who came to evangelize? How many times have you been taught to fear what was sacred within you? It's time to make peace with your origins. It's time to reconnect with your spiritual lineage. It's time to understand that before the prophets you know from the Bible, there were prophets who carried the voice of the eternal in their gaze, their gestures, their advice, their song, their dance, their silence. And now, I want you to tell me what you felt when you heard all this. Leave it here in the comments. I honor the prophets of my people, or God already spoke to us before the Bible. Your comment helps keep this conversation alive. It shows the algorithm that this topic matters. It shows that you're waking up, that you no longer accept the story told by those who erased you. And when we speak of these interpreters of the divine, these men and women who walked with the Creator long before the biblical prophets were mentioned, we're not talking about mythical, distant, or symbolic figures. We're talking about real people, people with flesh, blood, soul, and spirit, who lived deeply connected to the principles of the invisible, people who carried in their eyes the wisdom of the heavens, and in their words the weight of collective destiny. They were the guardians of their people's spiritual memory. They were the pillars of a living, practical, and profound faith. They were the ones who knew that life was more than birth and death. It was a mission. These wise men, these spiritual leaders, often didn't even have a name recorded in books, but their actions, teachings, and choices left such profound marks on subsequent generations that they continue to resonate to this day. It doesn't matter whether they were called griots, elders, sacred sorcerers, masters of the word, eyes of heaven, or ears of the earth. What they did was the same as the prophets did in Scripture: interpret God's signs to guide the people. Imagine an old man beneath a sacred tree, surrounded by the community, listening to the people's problems, offering advice based on ancestral wisdom, indicating paths to peace, denouncing injustice, rebuking vanity, comforting the afflicted, foreseeing difficult times, and calling for fasting and purification for reconciliation with the Creator. Tell me honestly, what is the difference between this old man and a prophet like Elijah, Amos, or Jeremiah? The only difference is in the name and the historical record, but the essence is the same. These interpreters of the divine understood the cycles of life. They knew when to plant and when to harvest. They knew when the land was contaminated by impure acts. They knew when the people needed to return to silence, shed their pride, come into contact with truth, and reconcile with the sacred. They didn't speak of God merely as a concept. They spoke as if they had already encountered him in the early morning, on the mountain, in the river, in the hearts of children. Some of these leaders received such clear dreams that upon waking, they already knew what they needed to do to protect their village. Others used sacred symbols, drawings, vocal intonations, chants, and specific dances to enter spiritual states where they heard what the people could not. Their words carried authority, their actions, consistency, their choices, courage. They lived what they preached, and for that, the people respected them. And most impressively, many of the principles that guided these African prophets are almost identical to those we see in Jesus' teachings. Love for one's neighbor, valuing the poor, widows, and orphans, the search for inner truth, fasting as a spiritual tool, service as an honor, the awareness that everything is interconnected, that one cannot offend nature without offending oneself, that one cannot lie to one's brother without wounding one's own soul. All of this was already lived. It was already taught. It was already practiced, long before the term prophet became an institutional religious title. And there was another fundamental aspect. These spiritual leaders didn't charge for service. They didn't make a spectacle of their revelation. They didn't seek applause. They didn't seek positions. They knew their gift came from something much greater, and therefore it was a responsibility, a sacred mission, not a trade, not a show. They suffered when the people erred. They wept when the land fell ill. They fasted for the collective good. They endured isolation, loneliness, and misunderstanding, like all true prophets throughout history. Can you see how closely all of this aligns with biblical accounts? And yet, over the centuries, this spirituality has been ridiculed, erased, and defamed. How many times have you heard that African peoples were lost, given over to idolatry, witchcraft, and spiritual ignorance? How many times have you been taught that God only began speaking to Africa after the cross arrived with the colonizers? But now you know, long before the cross, there was revelation. Long before the Bible, there was wisdom. Long before the church, there was communion with the Creator. And these ancient prophets were instruments of this connection. They prepared the people for planting and harvest, physical and spiritual. They connected heaven and earth. They gave meaning to suffering. They rekindled hope. They condemned corruption. They called for justice. They called the people back to the path, just like the biblical prophets we so respect today. That's why acknowledging these African prophets is so important. Because when you deny their existence, you're denying part of the Creator's history with humanity. You're saying, without even realizing it, that there was only truth where there was writing, that there was only spirituality where there was a temple, that there was only revelation where there was a Bible. And this isn't just a mistake, it's a grave spiritual erasure. And perhaps you, right now, are feeling your heart burn. Because something inside you has always known it made no sense to imagine that God only began speaking 3,000 years ago. Always known there was more, that there was before, that there were roots, that there was a voice in the wind, a message in the ancestors, a presence in the invisible. Do you feel that this truth sets you free? That it doesn't distance you from God, but brings you closer? That it doesn't make you reject the faith you've learned, but helps you better understand who you are within it? So tell me, had you ever heard of these African prophets before the biblical prophets? Have you ever felt that your ancestors were calling you to something greater, deeper, more connected to the essence of faith? Right here in the comments, God spoke to my people before religion. Or, I recognize the prophets of my blood. And if what you've heard so far has shaken your perception of faith and spiritual identity, what I'm about to show you now can solidify that reconstruction once and for all. Because what many call merely oral tradition or tribal myth, when looked at seriously, reveals an ocean of ancestral evidence that points to an indisputable truth. The African people worshipped the Creator long before any biblical verse was written. For centuries, Western academia ignored, ridiculed, or reinterpreted this evidence. But there are records, studies, artifacts, and testimonies, many of them purposefully forgotten, that clearly reveal how different African civilizations developed spiritual, moral, and ritual structures centered on the belief in a supreme God, an invisible, just, and eternal Creator, not represented by images, but perceived through nature, the cosmic order, and ancestral wisdom. If you look at the ancient civilizations of the Nile Valley, for example, you'll see a completely sophisticated spiritual system. Ma'at, which we've already discussed here, wasn't just an ethical concept, it was a divine principle that governed all relationships between human beings, the earth, and the cosmos. Anything that deviated from Ma'at was seen as Isfet, chaos, disorder, evil, and the goal of human beings was to align their lives with Ma'at, with divine balance. This is recorded in temples, statues, hieroglyphics, tombs, and rituals recorded thousands of years before the Bible existed. And when we talk about African spirituality, we're not talking about something fragmented. There are structures, there are coherent narratives, there are moral codes. The Dogons, for example, known for their ancient astronomical precision, already spoke of stars that were only discovered by modern science in the 20th century. But more than that, they already recognized Amma as the supreme God, the one who created the universe with order and purpose, long before any written revelation. In excavations carried out in regions of Ethiopia and Nubia, for example, archaeologists have discovered remains of ceremonial centers, sacred tombs, symbolic inscriptions, and evidence of spiritual rituals centered on the veneration of a single entity, creator of all things. And what's most intriguing is that, upon careful analysis of these records, we see an almost identical resemblance to the principles later found in Abrahamic religions. Only here, we're talking about 2,000 or 3,000 years before the emergence of formal Judaism. And it doesn't stop there. Scholars such as Cheikh Anta Diop, John Mbiti, and Molefi Kete Asante have argued, based on decades of research, that the religious structures of pre-colonial Africa not only recognized a supreme God, but also possessed complex doctrines about the soul, destiny, justice, and the afterlife. These scholars even directly challenge the Eurocentric idea that divine revelation began in the Middle East. For them, Africa not only knew the Creator, it was the cradle of the first revelation. And there's more. In West Africa, particularly among the Akan, Yoruba, Bantu, and Fon peoples, there are oral records that tell creation stories with incredible theological depth. These stories tell of a God who forms the world with wisdom, who breathes spirit into human beings, who establishes laws of conduct, who punishes evil and rewards good. These narratives speak of the fall, redemption, and restoration, concepts absolutely aligned with the biblical essence, but which emerged independently and long before the Jewish records. Now imagine the impact of recognizing this. Imagine what this means for millions of black people who have learned to see themselves as spiritually inferior, who have been taught to forget their ancestry, to deny their origins, to treat with contempt everything that came from Africa. When you access this evidence, everything changes. You begin to understand that your faith didn't begin in Europe, that the Creator has always been present in your story, that the divine already spoke to his people before any mission, cross, or catechesis. There are also records of ancient ceremonies where the rituals didn't involve idols or images, but rather chants, circular dances, prayers addressed to heaven, purifications with water, sacred silences before specific trees, fasting, and even communal confession. Healing rituals that didn't rely on magic formulas, but on reconciliation with the truth. Can you see how close this is to the principles taught by Jesus? And that's why colonization needed to erase all of this. Because if this spirituality were recognized, validated, and valued, colonial rule would not be sustainable. How do you impose a new religion on a people who already know the Creator? How do you catechize a people who already have their own codes of revelation, who already practice justice, who already recognize eternity, who already know that evil does not go unpunished, who already seek connection with the invisible? The answer is simple. You erase their spiritual memory. You say that everything they believe is demonic, superstition, savagery, And you offer a new God as the only alternative for salvation. But now the truth is returning. Memory is being restored. Evidence is being recognized, studied, and recovered. And the more we look with open eyes, the more we realize that the Creator has always spoken, always revealed Himself, and Africa has always listened. So I want to hear from you now. Were you already familiar with any of this ancient evidence? Had you heard of Amma, Ma'at, Nzambi, or Olodumare? Which of these revelations has most touched your spirit so far? Write here in the comments. The Creator already spoke to my people before the Bible. Or, I'm reconnecting my faith with my roots. And now that you've seen how ancestral evidence screams the presence of the Creator in African civilizations since ancient times, it's time to look at another aspect that almost no one has the courage to expose. The Bible, which so many use to disconnect the African people from God, actually carries deep African roots. Yes, the Bible, the most cited book in the world as a reference of faith, is full of elements, characters, stories, and contexts that pass, directly or indirectly, through African soil. But nobody told you that. The dominant narrative has pushed the idea that Africa has always been outside the covenant, always outside the revelation. But when you open the Bible with decolonized eyes, with a mind unshaped by centuries of exclusion, what you find is something very different. What you find is a book born in a context deeply connected to Africa. You begin to see that the Bible is not a European product. It is, in large part, African. Let's start where many fear to look: Egypt. Did you know that Egypt, this African territory, is the most frequently mentioned place in the Bible after Israel? Yes, over 700 direct mentions. And we're not talking about just any role. It was in Egypt that Joseph, son of Jacob, not only served as governor, but also as a savior of entire nations from famine. Joseph was a Hebrew, but he became the father of a mixed lineage because he married an Egyptian, the daughter of a priest. This means that half the tribe of Ephraim and half the tribe of Manasseh, two fundamental tribes of Israel, have African blood. And Moses, the one who led the Hebrew people out of slavery, the one to whom God gave the 10 Commandments. Moses was born in Egypt, raised in Egypt, educated in African culture, fed by African women, trained in Egyptian palaces, and knowledgeable in local laws and wisdom. He was a man shaped by Africa. What's more, when he fled Egypt, he went to live among the Midianites, a people descended from Abraham with an African woman named Keturah. Yes, the spiritual lineage of the patriarch of faith himself had already intermingled with Africa from the beginning. And when you look at the story of Jesus, the epicenter of Christianity, Africa's presence is also there. Jesus, as a child, fled with his parents to where? Egypt. It was there, in African territory, that he was protected from Herod's wrath. It was there that the Son of God was sheltered. It was African soil that welcomed the Messiah while the world wanted him dead. And this was no accident. This shows that the African continent was not alien to the divine plan. It was part of the route of salvation. And there's more. In the book of Acts, who was the first foreigner baptized by an apostle? An Ethiopian eunuch, a man who served Queen Candace, Queen of Ethiopia. He was reading Isaiah in his chariot when he was approached by Philip. And there, on the side of the road, without a temple, without a crowd, without ceremony, African Christianity was born, the first outside the Jewish context. The gospel arrived in Africa not as an imposition, but as a response to a spiritual quest that had already existed for centuries among those people. These details were hidden or minimized for centuries because the dominant system wasn't interested in showing that Africa was part of the revelation from the beginning. It was more convenient to portray Africans as objects of mission than as active participants in sacred history. It was more convenient to transform them into passive recipients of faith than protagonists of their own spirituality. But the Bible reveals another reality. It shows African peoples receiving revelations, having visions, being part of promises, contributing gifts, wisdom, and alliances. Want another example? In the book of Numbers, Moses marries an Ethiopian woman. Miriam and Aaron complain, and God rebukes them harshly. The text not only validates the marriage, but also shows that racial and ethnic prejudice is not pleasing to God. The Creator had no problem with Moses' union with an African woman. But today's religious system pretends this verse doesn't exist because it breaks the entire logic of cultural separation that has been imposed throughout history. You begin to realize then that the Bible isn't against Africa. It's deeply intertwined with Africa. But to recognize this, you need to free yourself from the perspective you've been taught. You need to remove the colonizing filter that distorted everything. You need to see that many of the stories you were taught as white people's stories are, in fact, stories of black people, of black territories, of cultures spiritually developed and connected to the heavens long before Europe even existed as a religious power. Even the figures of the wise men who visited Jesus at his birth, the so-called Magi from the East, are shrouded in mystery. But studies show that some of them may have come from Ethiopia or African Arabia. The gold, frankincense, and myrrh were not European products. They were elements that came from African trade routes, carrying spiritual significance for millennia. And once again, Africa appears as the cradle of gifts for Christ. When you put all these pieces together, you begin to understand that what was hidden from you wasn't just cultural information. It was a spiritual revelation. They hid from you the fact that you are part of the lineage of faith, that you weren't invited at the last minute, that your people didn't arrive last in line for salvation. Quite the opposite. The African people were there from the beginning, participating, serving, receiving, giving, walking with the Creator. And perhaps now you understand why it's so important to reclaim this heritage. Because without it, your faith is incomplete. Without it, you worship God but deny yourself. Without it, you carry a sacred book but reject your own story within it. And that's exactly what they wanted you to do. But you don't have to repeat this cycle anymore. You can break free now. You can look at the Bible and see your reflection there. You can understand that God's plan has always included His people. Always. So tell me, what did you feel when you heard all this? Right here in the comments, the Bible has African roots, or my people are in the pages of Revelation. And given all that we have revealed so far, the ancient spiritual practices of the African people, the prophets before the prophets, the ancestral evidence, and the African roots present in the Bible itself, a question arises that needs to be asked, an uncomfortable but inevitable question. Why was all this hidden? Why has no one ever told us this truth? Why, if it is so clear that Africa has been present since the earliest chapters of the history of faith, has it still been erased from humanity's spiritual memory? The answer is harsh, but it must be stated bluntly. There was an intentional, systematic, and perverse plan to erase African spiritual origins. It wasn't by chance. It wasn't carelessness. It was a plan. It was strategic. And it began at the exact moment European colonization realized it could not dominate a people who knew who they were, a people who recognized their direct connection to the Creator, a people who knew their own sacred history. A people with spiritual self-esteem is a people impossible to enslave. Colonization wasn't just territorial, it was also symbolic, psychological, and religious. Along with the weapons, ships, shackles, and whips came the crosses. Dogmas came. Eurocentric doctrines came. Discourses of racial inferiority disguised as an evangelizing mission came. And with this, millions of Africans were forced to abandon their rituals, their beliefs, their names, their music, their languages, their symbols, and everything that connected them to the divine. Imagine the impact of this. A people who knew how to communicate with the Creator without intermediaries, suddenly being forced to believe that their faith would only be valid if it passed through the European filter, that their path to God only existed if it was validated by a religious structure that never saw them as equals. A people who heard God's voice in the wind, in the earth, in fire, in water, now being taught that all of this was the work of evil. A people who related to the sacred through their own symbols, now being taught that their symbols were cursed. This is not evangelization. This is spiritual domination. And this domination was so profound that it spanned centuries. It shaped textbooks, catechism programs, pulpit speeches, film narratives, biblical translations, theological interpretations, and even the images of Jesus that still hang on church walls today. As a European man, with light eyes and straight hair, completely disconnected from the Semitic and African context of the Bible itself. This was not innocent. It was deliberate, calculated, implanted. Because, you see, if a people understand that their ancestors were savages, that their spiritual history is pagan, that their identity is incompatible with God. These people will be eternally dependent on the oppressor to be saved. These people will not rise up. They will not resist. They will submit. They will accept anything in the name of salvation. And that's exactly what happened to millions of Africans and their descendants around the world. Entire generations growing up believing they were born far from God, that they were included by mercy, that they came later, that they were the tail and not the head. This is a lie. This is manipulation. This is a hijacking of faith. And the worst part is that this lie has been institutionalized. It has infiltrated churches, theological schools, seminaries, history books, university curricula, catechism materials. And today, unfortunately, there are still black people repeating this rhetoric against themselves. People who deny their own ancestry, who feel ashamed of their spiritual roots, who disconnect from the Creator, thinking they are getting closer to Him. People who, unknowingly, kneel before a faith that was constructed to keep them captive. But that is changing. And the fact that you're here, listening to this, is proof of that. We are living in a time of reconnection, of revelation. A time when the Spirit of the Creator is blowing strongly, awakening minds, rekindling memories, healing the wounded spirituality of a people taught to hate themselves. It is a time of restoration, a time to look within and realize that the temple of the sacred has never been a European place. It has always been the body, the land, the heart, the spirit of the African people. And perhaps now you're wondering, why didn't anyone ever tell me this? Why was this topic never mentioned in the churches I attended? Why isn't it in the books? Why wasn't this taught in Bible school? Because it doesn't interest the dominant system. Because if you know that your spirituality didn't begin with colonization, you become free. Free to reconnect with the Creator without guilt. Free to value your ancestry without fear. Free to live your faith with dignity and truth. Religious colonization robbed us of our right to be whole. It divided our faith into two parts. One that was acceptable, the one that came from Europe, and another that was forbidden, the one that came from Africa. And this division created a chasm within us, a spiritual void, a constant struggle between identity and salvation, between blood and heaven, between ancestors and apostles. But this chasm is being closed. This void is being filled. This struggle is being won by the truth you are now rediscovering. Because now you know, your spirituality wasn't born of slavery. It was enslaved. But before that, it was already free. It was already alive. It was already full of light. It was already full of God. And I really want to know what this part of our journey has done for you. Comment here. My faith was hijacked, but now I'm getting it back. Or, I wasn't born far from God. I was taught to believe so. Now that you understand how the roots of African faith have been systematically erased, and have seen how the Creator has always been present before any scripture, any cross, or any institution, it's time to face one of the deepest and most uncomfortable questions that many avoid asking, especially within traditional religious settings. Does God belong to a religion? Is the Creator limited to a specific theological system? Or does He speak to all people in different ways, at different times, with different languages, but with the same essence? The truth is that the Creator was never confined to a temple. He was never held hostage by labels. He never belonged to a single people. And the most intriguing thing, He always revealed Himself to those who sincerely sought Him, even if those seekers didn't have a Bible in their hands, a pulpit in front of them, or an institutional religion behind them. And this changes everything, because it means that contact with the Eternal One doesn't depend on doctrines, but on intention. It doesn't depend on liturgy, but on connection. It doesn't depend on tradition, but on inner truth. And when we begin to observe spiritual experiences around the world honestly, not with the eyes of religious judgment, but with the heart of deep listening, we begin to perceive a surprising pattern. The Creator speaks. He speaks to everyone, in different ways, yes, but He speaks. And when He speaks, He doesn't ask if you are a member, baptized, evangelical, Catholic, Adventist, Muslim, or Yoruba. He asks if you are ready to listen, if your heart is clean, if you are willing to obey. Indigenous peoples who have never had contact with the God of the Bible report experiences of spiritual ecstasy, visions, and revelations that change the course of their lives. African tribes who never heard of Abraham or Moses had moral codes that involved justice, empathy, forgiveness, care for the weak, reverence for the sacred, and respect for creation. Asian peoples who were never exposed to Christianity report mystical experiences where they found peace, meaning, and divine guidance that transformed them completely. What does this tell us? It tells us that God is not the property of a plaque, a book, or a denomination. The Creator is greater than all of this. He is presence. He is consciousness. He is spirit. And as spirit, He moves where He wills, in whom He wills, when He wills. He does not need human authorization to manifest Himself. He does not need ecclesiastical approval to touch a soul. He does not need specific rituals to respond to a genuine cry, because what He seeks is truth. It is purity of heart. It is hunger for justice. It is thirst for something that goes beyond logic. And this is where we begin to understand why so many have been taught to fear what is different, to demonize other spiritual experiences, believing that truth only exists where the Bible exists, that God only exists where the church exists, that revelation only exists where Christianity exists. But did the Creator let the rest of humanity live in darkness for millennia until a single group discovered the truth? Could it be that millions of human beings were born and died without any chance of connecting with the sacred, simply because they were born far from Jerusalem or Rome? This idea makes no sense. It's limited. It's too small for the greatness of a God who created all peoples, all languages, all cultures. A God who reveals Himself in the clouds, in the forest, in the river, in meditation, in the silence of dawn, in the cry of the afflicted soul. A God who always had an open channel with those who truly sought Him, even if they had no name for Him, even if they called Him something else, even if they perceived Him only as a force, a light, or a creative principle. And the most beautiful thing is realizing that when we begin to humbly study these manifestations, we discover common principles. All these genuine experiences with the Creator, even in the most isolated cultures, point to similar values: love, truth, balance, respect for life, compassion, justice, harmony with nature, humility. This cannot be a coincidence. It is a sign that the Spirit blows where it wills, that the Creator has spoken for a long time, in many languages, in many forms, but always with the same purpose: to teach us to live as children of the light. Can you imagine what this revelation means? It breaks down walls. It heals the mind. It frees us from the prison of religion and invites us into a living, expansive spirituality that unites rather than divides, that recognizes that the God of all is not lesser because He belongs to everyone, but greater because He allows Himself to be encountered by all. And no, this doesn't invalidate the Bible. On the contrary, it helps us read it with new eyes. Because when Jesus says that the wind blows where it wishes, you hear the sound, but you don't know where it comes from or where it goes, He is teaching us exactly this: that the Spirit is not contained, that the divine cannot be tamed, that the experience with the Creator cannot be bottled, sold, manipulated, or controlled by any institution. The Bible shows us the way, but it is not the way itself. It is the map, not the destination. The Creator is the destination, and He is far beyond the boundaries of religion. He is in the streets, in the fields, in the villages, in the mountains, in the deserts, in the toreros, in the rosaries, in the indigenous chants, in the ancestral songs, in the eyes of those who seek truth. And perhaps now you're feeling a weight lift from your shoulders, because for so long you were told you were outside, that your faith was invalid, that your culture was cursed, that your ancestors were lost. But now you're beginning to see that the Creator has always been near. Always. Even when religion said He wasn't. And I really want to know how this is affecting you. Comment here: the Creator speaks to everyone, or God does not fit into a religion. He also writes in His own words if you'd like. Tell me what you felt. Your comment is a sign that this truth is spreading. After everything we've revealed so far, the erased spiritual origins, the ancestral evidence, the African presence in the Bible, and the certainty that the Creator speaks to all peoples, now is the time to connect the dots. Because the truth before us, when looked at honestly, reveals something many never imagined. African spirituality and Christianity are not enemies. They are not opposites. They are not incompatible. On the contrary, there is an invisible bridge between them that has always existed, but has been hidden. This bridge is called essence. And when we look at the essence of ancestral African spiritual practices and compare it with the central tenets of early Christianity, we find a striking number of parallels, profound similarities that are no coincidence, but a sign that the Spirit has always moved in diverse ways among peoples. Because the Creator is coherent, He does not change. And so, when He manifests in different cultures, the essence always carries the same DNA: justice, purity, connection, truth, love, spiritual responsibility. Let's start with prayer. In ancient African traditions, prayer was not an automatic, repetitive, or soulless act. It was a moment of profound silence, or of lofty chanting, or of devotional dance, where body and soul united to express reverence. Prayer was an invocation, a conscious call to the invisible world, a dialogue with the Creator or with the intermediaries of creation, the ancestors. It was done with gratitude, with clear intentions, with responsibility. And what do we see in true Christianity? A prayer that goes beyond words, a prayer that seeks alignment, that touches the innermost, that seeks the face of God in spirit and in truth. Do you see the similarity? And fasting? In African cultures, fasting has always been linked to spiritual purification. It wasn't simply abstaining from food, but emptying oneself to hear better. It was a practice for times of crisis, of choice, of seeking direction, of repentance. Fasting was both individual and collective. The community could fast together to pray for rain, to heal someone, to restore balance. It was sacred. It was profound. And in Christianity, fasting carries precisely this function: to break pride, to silence the flesh, to open the spirit, to hear the voice of God. Do you see the bridge? And the rituals? African spirituality has always had rituals marked by symbols, gestures, and natural objects charged with meaning. Leaves, water, fire, ash, sound. These elements were not idolized, but rather plumbers. They were representations of the invisible, not substitutes for the Creator. They served to align the community with the cycles of nature and the spiritual world. It was a spirituality that touched the earth and the sky at the same time. And early Christianity, it also had symbolic rituals: the Lord's Supper, baptism, anointing with oil, the laying on of hands, the washing of feet. All these are acts that, at their core, are not very different from African rituals in essence. And the moral code? Here lies perhaps the greatest similarity of all. What do Jesus' teachings convey? Love for one's neighbor, forgiveness, care for the poor, justice for the oppressed, truth in the heart, rejection of religious hypocrisy, sincerity of faith, generosity, spiritual responsibility. And what have ancient African cultures taught for centuries? The same. The structure of Ma'at, for example, taught that one should not lie, steal, humiliate others, shed blood unjustly, be greedy, disrespect elders, or deceive others. It's the same principle: live truthfully before the divine and the collective. Even the concept of community as a spiritual space is deeply shared. African spirituality has always understood that faith does not exist in isolation, that the healing of the individual is linked to the healing of the village, that the offense of one affects all, that the blessing of one should be celebrated by all. And early Christianity also taught this: bear one another's burdens. We are members of one another. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am. Spirituality is not only vertical, it is also horizontal. It is with God, but it is also with others. And here comes the most important revelation. There is no conflict between African spirituality and Christianity when we remove the veil of racism, colonization, and theological ignorance. What exists, in fact, is a profound connection. What exists is a bridge that was cut, a spiritual thread that was severed. But this is now being reconnected, because this is not about syncretism. It is about essence. It is about recognizing that the same God who revealed himself at Sinai also spoke in the deserts of the Sahel, that the same Spirit who moved at Pentecost was also moving in the forests of the Congo, the valleys of Ethiopia, the mountains of Zimbabwe, long before the world knew the term Christianity. And maybe this is the liberation you needed, because perhaps you grew up thinking that to be a Christian you had to deny your roots, that to follow Jesus you had to forget your ancestors. that to worship God you had to hide your culture. But now you see, there is no contradiction between who you are and who God has called you to be. There is no conflict between your faith and your ancestry when both are anchored in truth, justice, humility, and love. You don't have to choose between Africa and Christ. You can, and should, live a faith reconciled with your identity. You can fast with purpose, pray with truth, worship with body and soul, dance with meaning, celebrate with awareness, and still follow in the footsteps of Jesus, not the Eurocentric Jesus, but the real, profound, prophetic Jesus, who broke paradigms, who stood up against unjust systems, who valued the invisible, who walked with the forgotten, who saw beauty where the world only saw rejection. And all of this points to a possible spiritual future, a decolonized Christianity, where Black, Indigenous, peripheral, broken, and reconstructed people can live their faith without shame, without fear, without cultural mutilation. A path where one doesn't choose between the Bible and one's ancestry, but where one understands that God already spoke to his people before ink and paper, and continues to speak to them now, through you. If this touched your heart, write here in the comments, "My faith and my ancestry go hand in hand," or "I don't need to deny my roots to follow the Creator." If you'd like, comment in your own way too, but comment. This helps this truth spread and helps me understand what this message has awakened in you. If you've stayed with me this far, it already shows me that you're part of this spiritual awakening movement. It wasn't by chance that you made it to the end. This means your heart is ready to reconnect with the truth they tried to hide for so long. So do this now. Subscribe to the channel. Don't put it off. This is the place where you will continue to strengthen yourself spiritually, reconnecting with faith, identity, and ancestry. And comment below now. I made it to the end because I am reconnecting with my spiritual origin. I want to see who truly walked with me to the end of this journey. Your comment is like a spiritual seal saying, "I have awakened." Oh, and of course, leave a like if this message touched you, because that way we can spread this light to more people. And take advantage of the next video appearing on your screen now. Click and stay with us, because the awakening doesn't stop here.